East Hampton Town Board, we are live.
Thank you, Jason, and good morning, everyone, and welcome to the East Hampton Town Board work session for February 15th, which was originally slated to take place on February 13th, but we had to cancel due to the weather. Carol, if you could please take the roll call.
Councilmember Flight?
Present.
Councilmember Lease?
Present.
Councilmember Rogers?
Present.
Councilmember Calder Piedmont?
Present.
Supervisor Burke Gonzalez?
Present. If everyone could please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So on today's work session agenda, we open with public portion, and we ask that folks keep their comments to 3 minutes, please. We have a long meeting ahead. We then go into topics. We've got bids with Jeannie Carrozza. Then we're going to hear about the Montauk Playhouse construction bids from Scott Baradino from ISC, and then we'll have the folks from AKRF and the other consultants give us a presentation on the East Hampton Town Airport draft generic environmental impact statement, and then Councilmember David Lease will give a FIMP update. Then we'll do liaison reports and resolutions. So let's start with the public portion. Carol, do we have anyone signed up? Oh. Thanks. Great. JB DeSantos. Welcome, JB.
Good morning, Madam Supervisor and distinguished friends and board members. Welcome to a beautiful Thursday.
Oh, could you do me a favor? Could you just move the microphone a little bit closer to you?
Sorry.
Thank you.
Sorry about
Thank
that,
you. Thank you.
My name is JB DeSantos, and I'm here to lend some support to the construction of the senior center. You know, I do not look or feel like I'm in my mid-60s, but this is your typical senior today. So I recently began having lunch at the senior center on Springs Fireplace Road. The food is good, nice people. I get to hang out with some of my old buddies, and I truly enjoy their company and the food. But the facility I do not like much. But it's an old structure. So we always heard, sure as Joe, if you build it, they will come. I believe in the mid-90s, we decided to expand our library. And of course, funds was a problem. Someone came up with the idea of buying bricks. So being part of the community, my family purchased a brick. So if you go into the library, you see a brick with our name. Then we didn't have a place for our youth. And we started talking, the late Mark Mapes, Tom Lawrence, and a number of other folks, and negotiating with the village. They donated 1.5 acre parcel for the construction of what was to be the rec center. We didn't have money, so we had to fundraise. Knocked on doors, raised a lot of money, and the estimated cost back then was about $3 million, given or taken, cost about $4.5 million to have the building complete. The rec center was open. My family was one of the first ones to sign up for the membership. We enjoyed. Kathy's kids were taking swimming lessons back with my kids back then. Now, that was complete, I believe, in 1998. If we were, I'm not a math whiz, but if we took $4.5 million and put it in the bank back then, simple investment, it would most likely yield a compound interest of around $8 million. Simple interest, only around $7 million. Today would be worth maybe $22 million. Fast forward 26 years later, we do need a senior center in East Hampton. We are one of the wealthiest towns in the nation. We have people who do need it. When you go to the senior center, you see modest people at lunch. They deserve a better place like I deserve. We love singing, we love dancing, interacting with the people. it would be a welcoming place. That place would serve not only to serve food, for get together for many other activities that we seniors of today will enjoy. The town was very lucky in acquiring the 7-acre parcel from the Cabas family. I had been in talk with them about subdividing and selling the parcels. They chose to sell the property to the town for a lot less money than I could have brought them. We own the land. Where would the money come from? I love the design. I love everything that's out there that is beautiful, that exciting, that brings life into everyday life. And the plans, the design, I love it. 32 million, it's a lot of money. Where will that money come from? But we can do what we did with the library, with the YMCA, start something and put something together that can grow over the years. Every year, I'll donate $1,000, I'll donate maybe $2,000. Many other wealthy friends, I'm not wealthy, I'm a little guy, will put money towards that. We can maybe name a bench after their family or something. We can do it. Again, if we build it, they will come, for sure. $4.5 million, 1998. It was not net zero, a net zero building. It didn't have a low nitrogen wastewater system, which is good for the environment. We need to take care of the environment, otherwise how we're going to survive. So we have to do something. We can brainstorm, come up with a plan. Let's fundraise. Let's build something that will last. My generation will probably live to be 100. There is replacement parts, there is everything. And again, look at me, mid-60s and still looking this good. Just a second. We have to understand, the world is made up of people who see the glass always half empty, others will see the glass half full. People criticize because it's in their DNA. They can be constructive. They can't work with other people. I'm not saying they're bad people. It's just the way they see things. But where were those people when we were fundraising to expand the library, to build the YMCA rec center? I don't recall none of them working along me, Tom Lawrence, the late Mark Mapes. Where were you, friends? Now, it's in our DNA. Alexander the Great in Alexandria, very wealthy, powerful man, but he was miserable. So he always heard there was a line of philosophers called Cadello. They were poor, they had nothing under their names, but they were extremely happy. One day he decided to pay them a visit and find out why they were so happy with so little. He got there and he stood there while the philosophers were there, and he said, "What makes you so happy? You have nothing under your name." And one of them said, "Would you please step aside from the line of the sun?" I rest my case. And I'm here if you guys want me to get involved and help do something. Let's build the senior center because I want to dance, I want to sing, and I want to party. And my generation want to do the same. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, JB. Is there anyone else here that would like to address the board? Jason, do we have anybody on the phone line?
Checking right now. We have no one on the phone line.
Okay, thank you. So we'll move on to topics. Jeannie, you want to kick us off with bids?
Good morning.
Morning.
Okay, I have a few bids and a couple renewals. The first is for the windmill kitchen renovations, and that's Sierra Contractors Corp. in an amount not to exceed $85,500, and all of that will be based on the different kitchen layouts that they have. Next is the agreement with Hampton Hopper, the extension of that, and that's for the East End commuter connection. It would be for 240 days, and the amount this year is $2,054.85 a day, and that's with the CPI increase. The next is the extension of the supply and delivery of Jet A and 100 low-lead fuel for the airport, and Ascent Aviation Group is the contractor for that. And lastly, a notice for the traffic signal repair and maintenance contract, and that's an annual contract that we have. And finally, we did a bid for the proposed renovations to the Montauk Playhouse Community Center, and Scott DeBaradino's here from Island Structures, and he's going to make the recommendation for the award for that project.
Great, thank you, Jeannie.
Okay, and just one quick note, I just received our certification for green purchasing, so I have to do that. Anyway,
Congratulations.
okay.
Thank you, Jean, for spearheading that effort as well. It's so important. Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning, Scott.
I am very happy to be here today to go over this with you. It's been a long time coming. So we have gone through and we would like to recommend the award of 4 contracts for the Montauk Playhouse Community Center. Just a broad overview of this project. Again, it's going to consist of renovation of the unfinished portion of the Playhouse, the lower level, which will consist of a pool, locker rooms, couple flex spaces, and then we're also recommending the second floor, which is 3 larger flex spaces or event spaces, along with some smaller spaces on the side that can be utilized in different ways. Warming kitchen, restroom facilities, site work on the west side of the building, as well as landscaping, lighting. So there'll be some additional parking. 2 new low nitrogen sanitary systems as well are part of this project, along with other subsurface drainage structures. So there are 4 contracts. One was for a general construction contractor, which we determined the apparent low bidder to be Crossroads Construction. We recommended along with that 3 alternates. One of them was for testing during the process of construction. The second was to replace FRP wall panels that we had in the base bid and the contract drawings with ceramic tile. And the third was to fit out the second floor of the upper story of it complete. The total amount for that, including the alternates, was $9,271,000. The second contract for this project is the mechanical contractor, so that'll be heating, ventilation, air conditioning systems, dehumidification for the pool. And again, the one alternate for that was for the Phase 2 scope of work at the second floor. That total contract amount, $2,845,000. Third contract is for plumbing and fire sprinkler, again with the alternate to do the second floor. Total contract amount, $825,500. And lastly, electrical and fire alarm with 3 alternates, 2 of which are additional power panels. One's for the pool, one is for the main system downstairs, because since the original building was built, there's some other stuff that's on that panel now that wasn't before, like the generator and such, so we needed to have a little bit more space in it. And the third alternate is for the second floor as well. And the total contract amount for that, $988,505. In addition to the 4 contracts, we had vetted each one of these contractors, went through their schedules, schedule of values, past projects, references, in order to come up with these as the apparent low bidders. In addition to that, we are also recommending that you have a 5% contingency for cost of construction. That would include anything that's unforeseen, any changes that you want to make during construction, et cetera, would be included in that 5% contingency. Just as a side, though, in addition to the contingency, we already have built-in allowances for each one of the construction contracts that are built into the numbers that I just gave you. So for the general construction contract, we have an allowance of $75,000 already included in that number. For the H1 or the HVAC contract, that allowance is $25,000. For the P1 plumbing contract, $25,000. For the E1 electrical contract, $25,000. And just to circle back to the general construction contract, there's an additional $50,000 allowance that's in there for furnishings. Stuff like desks, chairs, that kind of stuff that we would recommend that we try to purchase through BOCES to be as cost-effective as possible. So we're hopeful, schedule-wise, for maybe an early April start. That would give us the advantage of having the warmth of the summer months to work through. And we're working on schedule right now, but as soon as we know that these folks are awarded, we'll have to get their feedback and we'll finalize that schedule. At which time that will be what goes in the project trailer in the field, and it will be what we are then able to use to give you a cost allocation. So what we anticipate monthly funds are going to be outgoing. The premise or the thought process right now is that we're going to start inside the building, probably with the hardest portion of the work, which is going to be excavation, footings, underpinning, and in construction of the second floor. And then we'll move out once the heavy lifting is done inside the building, and we know that we can work outside and not have to redo stuff that we've already done. We'll work our way out, and the site will be the tail end of the project. So that's really it. Any questions for me?
So Scott, this is approximately 25,000 square feet, is it not? For the two
It's 20.
stories?
Yeah, it's 24 and change, and it's not quite evenly split because there are some areas that are cathedral, like in the west lobby, that we have open on the second floor. So there's a little bit more square footage on the first floor than the second, but when you total them up, it's 24,900, somewhere in that frame.
Great. And just, I know there's a number of resolutions on tonight, David. I think you have the resolution to award the bids for these jobs, and then I'll have a resolution to accept the donation. The Montauk Playhouse Community Center Foundation has raised a staggering $8.25 million that they are, I believe they've already wired to the town, and it's going to be placed in a high-interest bearing account called NICLAS. The town had originally bonded $5 million, and we've decided to increase that to $5.5 million. So we'll be that'll be on for tonight. I know that the foundation has gotten a bid from New York State, Fred Thiel and Anthony Palumbo, a grant, reimbursable grant. So the town is going to be laying out the $1.75 million, and will be reimbursed. And so the monies will all be in place. We'll be working off the interest from the NICLAS account to help us offset the, if we need to go into, if we have change orders and we need to go into contingency. So I think we're in a pretty good spot right now, and it's, it's very exciting. Most folks know we have a double header today. So tonight at 6 o'clock, we'll have those resolutions on to approve.
My couple of comments here. It's another milestone moment for the town of East Hampton, and specifically the Hamlet and Montauk. I want to thank the supervisor for being the liaison to the Playhouse Foundation for years now. And the members of the foundation are commended for stepping up, and the members of the community for over a decade now. This is a community center for all the town of East Hampton, and it's another shining example of a very good public-private partnership with the town. So I as much as we did the shovel groundbreaking, here is the hard part. We get to the construction, and then the first cannonball we'll let Tom do into the pool.
It would be more exciting for us at Island. This is exciting for us at Island Structures too. Our firm has been working on this project for a lot of years. There's been a lot of hard work that's gone in for the past 20 years to get to this point. So we're as excited to get started as you are for us to get going.
Beautiful.
Excellent.
Any questions for
No,
Scott?
I have no questions.
As we continue on, I will be working with the Foundation's construction committee. We'll give periodic updates to the town board as we move ahead in my liaison reports, and maybe we'll even do more of those updates as a topic here, as we get to different points during the construction phases. And we'll make sure we have the construction administration that's going to be assisting with safety and such, and we'll make sure that all the different individuals that use the Playhouse are aware of what's going on upcoming. So we'll be working on that now that we know we have this done today.
Right. And one of the headlines is that we're doing phase 1 and phase 2 together. Because we had originally thought that we were only going to be doing the aquatic center, and the numbers came in the way they did. The foundation raised more money, and so that's exciting.
Yeah. I want to also, I know she's not here and she might be listening, Sarah Uticone, for chairing the committee currently right now, and all the past chairs. They've done a tremendous amount of work together to this point. We're not complete yet, but this is, as I said earlier, this is a milestone moment. So thank you, Madam Supervisor.
Thank you. Thanks, Scott, for making the trip out.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. So next up, we have the East Hampton Town Airport Draft Generic Environmental Impact Statement. Jason, if you could let all the folks into the meeting, that would be helpful.
Letting them all in right now.
Thank you. Audio.
Good morning.
Good morning and welcome. Thank you for your patience. We're still, I think, waiting for a few more folks to come in, correct?
Yes, we have a few all joining right now. A few of them have their videos off, though, so...
Okay.
I'm just going to trust everyone on Zoom to be able to see their fellow participants and then confirm when they have their full team together.
Great. Thanks, Jason.
Peter, it looks like we have our full complement.
Yeah, I think we're all here.
All right, beautiful.
Okay.
All right. Dan, do you want
Kathy,
to give an introduction?
Yeah, if I can. This is Dan Russo with Whiteman, Osterman, and Hanna. We are at a critical point in the SECRA process today. The draft generic environmental impact statement that has been in the works for now 10 months or so we believe is ready for your final acceptance. We're going to present today Peter Farrow from AKRF will present a rather lengthy review of the document. This is now stitched together from multiple drafts over the last 4 or 5 months that the board has seen and reviewed and provided comments on. But we're at this next critical stage for the acceptance of the draft so that we can get, equally important, public comments on the draft. We'll go through the process. In one of the slides, Peter will outline where we are in the total process. But with that, let me turn it over to Peter to introduce the document.
Okay, and introduce the team, please.
Oh, and the team, yeah. I'm sorry. Peter, why don't you go ahead and do that?
Thank you.
Sure, thank you. So my name is Peter Farrow. I'm a vice president with the firm AKRF. We're an environmental planning and engineering firm, and we've been working with the town over the past 2+ years on the airport, and we are leading the SECRA review, the State Environmental Quality Review Act, the environmental review, together with a very strong team. I'm joined, my colleagues Bob White and Gwen Siverici from AKRF are here. Also on the team is HMMH, kind of the world-class aviation consultant leading the aviation modeling, and Vin Corrado from LKMA, who needs very little introduction, leading the traffic studies for this project. So together with Dan and his firm at Whiteman, Osterman, Hanna, and Bill O'Connor at Cooley, leading the aviation side of the legal review. And we're happy to be in this position today, as Dan said. And so with your permission, I'd like to give an overview of the contents of the draft generic environmental impact statement that is before you for your acceptance.
Great.
All right, so if it's okay, I'm going to share my screen. And there we go.
Perfect.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, again. So what I'm going to do is run through a summary of the proposed town airport actions that the town board is considering, as well as a brief overview of the timeline for consideration of those actions. I'm going to give an overview of the SECRA process, that's the State Environmental Review that's mandated, talk about where we are in the process, where we've come from, and where we're going. And then I'm going to present an overview of the analyses of that are contained in the DGEIS. The DGEIS, once it is accepted as complete by the town board, will be publicly available. And as Dan said, the very important part of the SECRA process where we are able to receive public comments on those analyses. But what I wanted to do is be able to give a brief overview of the several technical studies that were performed as part of this review. So to be clear, the town is proposing, what we're talking about here is the town proposing to implement long-term operational policies through what's called a prior permission required, or PPR, framework that will regulate flight operations when it's legally permissible to do so. And the PPR framework would contain the following restrictions. There would be time-based restrictions, commonly referred to as a curfew at East Hampton Town Airport. There would be operator-based restrictions, such as restrictions on commercial operators, noise-based restrictions that would restrict the noisiest aircraft that would restrict the noisiest aircraft at the airport. There'd be size-based restrictions, so restricting by weight, the heaviest based, and then various other airport director permissions. And these are kind of one-off permissions, such as allowing touch and go operations, banner towing, etc. It's important to note the town is also considering environmental-based operational policies, such as restrictions or eliminations of lead-based fuel sales at some point in the future. Finally, as required by SECRA, the DGEIS studies various alternatives, and one of those alternatives is permanent closure of East Hampton Town Airport, EHTA, when it's legally permissible to do so, and that is included in the DGEIS. So, quick, brief history of the recent history on the airport and the town's efforts to regulate airport operations. So, in 2021, the town's grant assurance obligations from the FAA expired. And along with that, most federal obligations with respect to operations at the airport expired. The town had engaged in discussions with the FAA about the airport's future well before those grant obligations expired, culminating in a November 2020 letter from the FAA to the town with 4 options for the future operations of the town-owned airport. One was to maintain the status quo, to continue operating the airport as it was. Another was to permanently close the airport. A third was to negotiate voluntary agreements with current operators to limit operations. And the fourth was to close the public use airport and reopen as a private use airport, which would allow the town to implement a PPR. In 2021, the town undertook a year-long public engagement process called the re-envisioning process, where various alternatives to the airport's future were discussed. One of the outcomes of that process is that 80% of the participants within that re-envisioning process stated that the status quo was not acceptable to them. Continuing the airport operations in the way that they had been was not an acceptable outcome. So in 2021, 2022, the town drafted a prior permission required, a PPR framework, released it in March 2022. There were public comments on that framework, and a final PPR framework that incorporated comments from that public feedback was proposed in April 2022. In coordination with the FAA, the town closed the public use airport known as HTO on May 17th, 2022, and reopened a private use airport on May 19th, 2022, that's commonly now known as JPX. Those are the FAA call signs. Just as a quick side note, throughout the EIS, we are referring to the airport as the East Hampton Town Airport, or EHTA. The goal was to implement the PPR framework in the summer of 2022 to study the real-world impacts of the PPR, to have an idea of what results would happen if the town actually implemented the PPR. SECRA, the environmental review process, was completed for the closure and reopening. The town began the required scoping process for the 2022 summer study period, but litigation precluded that, and the PPR was not implemented in 2022, and there was no real-world study. It's important to note that while the FAA has reclassified the airport as a private use facility in accordance with federal regulations, the town has been operating the airport as if it were still a public use airport. So consistent with the pre-2022 policies and procedures, the town has been operating the airport as if it was a public use airport. So now getting to SECRA, the environmental review. So why is the town looking at the environmental impacts other than they want to look at the environmental impacts? Well, the PPR program, implementation of that, is a discretionary action of the town board. And discretionary actions with potential environmental effects are subject to the New York State Environmental Quality Review Act. SECRA requires that towns take a hard look at the potential environmental impacts of discretionary actions prior to permanently committing themselves to that action. So state law requires this environmental review. SECRA has various steps to ensure thorough environmental review, public participation throughout the process, and an examination of alternatives. So the process looks like this. Back in December of 2022, the town released a draft GEIS scope, and you can consider the GEIS scope to be a table of contents. It defined the areas of study. That draft was published, public comments were received, including at a public scoping session, and in April 2023, the town incorporated public comments and issued a final GEIS scope, and that dictated the required contents of the DGEIS. Since that time, the town and its consultants have been preparing the various studies and analyses required by that scope. Today, with those studies complete and after a lot of back and forth between the town board, town staff, consultants, attorneys, the town is in a position where they can consider accepting the draft GEIS or DGEIS as complete. And what that does is it starts a public comment period. It officially publishes the DGEIS, and the public may make comments on that DGEIS. There will be a public hearing as well as a written comment period. The town would then take all of those public comments received and respond to all substantive public comments as required by SECRA in what's called a final GEIS or FGEIS. Once the FGEIS is complete, the town would be in a position to issue what's called a finding statement. And a finding statement is the conclusion of the SECRA process. What it does is it's the town board's summary of the environmental impacts and mitigation that were discovered, published in the GEIS, and it sets forth the town board's rationale for their ultimate decision on the PPR. And that finding statement concludes the SECRA process. Once the SECRA process is concluded, the town board would be in a position to take action on implementing the PPR when it's legally permissible to do so. So pending other litigation, the SECRA process would then be concluded. So again, the DGEIS was prepared to study the specific actions being considered by the town board, which are the implementation of the PPR. So I just want to re-ground everyone. That's what the DGEIS is looking at. What are the potential environmental impacts of adopting the PPR? And as stated by the SECRA regulations, the whole purpose of the DGEIS is to allow the lead agency, in this case the town board, to choose from, and I'll quote, among the reasonable alternatives available, the action that avoids or minimizes adverse environmental impacts to the maximum extent practicable, consistent with social, economic, and other essential considerations. So this DGIS was prepared to provide the lead agency with information about the greatest adverse impacts that are reasonably foreseeable from the proposed action. So, consistent with the scope, the DGEIS focuses on the potential impacts generated from changes in the number of flight operations at the town-owned airport, EHTA, and other affected airports. So really what we're looking at, in essence, is the impacts of diverting flights from EHTA to other airports. And in this case, what we're looking at is Gabreski Airport, which is symbolized as FOK, Montauk Airport, and the Southampton Heliport. These are just the abbreviations for those airports, which I'll go into in a bit. But in essence, the DGEIS is looking at the potential impacts of flights that, but for the PPR, might have operated at East Hampton Town Airport, but now, because of the PPR, may operate at a different airport. So in accordance with the scope, the DGEIS included analyses regarding aircraft noise, air quality, emissions, and greenhouse gases, vehicular traffic and noise, natural resources, land use, public policy, and community character, and as we discussed, various alternatives to the PPR. This includes the no action alternative, as if the town board took no action, didn't do anything. It's required by SECRA. The full closure of East Hampton Town Airport to all flight operations, as well as an analysis of various alternatives to the permissions that are being proposed. Different curfew time, different operator-based restrictions, etc. So how did we conduct this DGEIS? So we started with always the very beginning, the existing conditions, which for the purposes of the DGEIS are defined as the period between January 2022 and December 2022. It's the last full calendar year of operations data that was available. The DGEIS analyzed 3 different time periods. So we looked at impacts across 3 different time periods. One is the annual time period, one is the summer time period, and one is the peak weekend time period. And we wanted to look at these 3 different time periods because we know that both the East Hampton Town Airport and the potentially affected airports all have seasonal variation in their use, extensive seasonal variation. And it was important for the DGEIS to capture that variation. So how did we figure out where flights that might be impacted by East Hampton would go and how many of them might actually be affected by the PPR? So we start off with the premise that because we were not able to conduct a real-world study, the precise amount of diversions and the location of those flight diversions is not knowable. We can't know it. There is no perfect model out there. And we weren't able to look at real-world impacts. So what we did is we developed what we're calling the greatest impact scenario. So we wanted to come up with what are the greatest impacts that are reasonably foreseeable, that could happen with the implementation of the PPR. So to develop this scenario, we made two critical assumptions. The first was we wanted to start with a high baseline of flights, or no action. So instead of just starting with the existing conditions and saying what would happen if the 2022 operations were to be impacted by the PPR, we wanted to look at what a reasonable highest baseline could be. So what we did is we looked back 5 years at operations at East Hampton Town Airport. We took the highest number of operations by aircraft type, so piston, turboprop, jet, helicopter, etc., from each of those 5 years, and we put them together, and we came up with a hypothetical number of flight operations that could have existed at East Hampton Town Airport, but didn't. It never did. So this was just a hypothetical kind of worst case scenario, and then we grew that number by 3% to go from 2022 to 2024 by 3% for 2 years, just to account for what we sometimes call background growth. And this was based on an FAA report. So as a result, the baseline that we looked at of how many flights could be diverted based on the PPR, we came up with a number of more than 37,000 annual operations at East Hampton Town Airport that could be that would happen in the future without the PPR. So instead of the existing conditions, we looked at this no action condition of 37,000 flights operating at East Hampton Town Airport. It's important to note that's 10% higher than the most recent annual peak, which occurred before COVID, and it's 47% more than the 2022 operations. So we started with this really high number of hypothetical existing operations, the no action operations. And then the second assumption was we assumed that every operation that could be affected by the PPR would actually continue to operate and would operate at one of the affected airports. So we assumed that no airport operation that was affected by the PPR would simply not fly or would adjust their operations to comply with the PPR. We wanted to look at the greatest possible impacts to the other airports of the greatest number of flights that has the potential to operate based on the PPR. As a result, this scenario leads to an overestimation of the increase in operations at the affected airports. It really is the upper end and maybe even a little bit above the upper end, but we wanted to do that so that the full impacts of what could be were understood by the town board, since we did not know the precise impacts of the PPR. So now that we have kind of the baseline flights, we assume that any flight impacted by the PPR would divert to either Montauk Airport, which is a privately owned airport, has no tower, and really only the smallest of jets can operate there due to its runway length. Gabreski Airport, which is a publicly owned airport that has a voluntary curfew. It can handle all airframe types and has full tower control. Or the Southampton Heliport, which is publicly owned and, as its name implies, can only handle helicopters. So we assume that any flight impacted by the PPR would divert to one of these three airports. In addition, we performed a sensitivity analysis for the potential of seaplane operations to divert to Sag Harbor Bay. So how do we figure out which airport these diverted flights might end up operating at? So we looked at, can the operation physically operate at the airport, right? The largest jets can't operate at Montauk, can't operate at the Southampton Heliport, so we know they have to go to Gabreski, and so on and so forth. And then we looked at, once we knew which ones could physically operate there, we looked at locational preferences. So we looked at the destination of passenger trips in vehicles leaving East Hampton Town Airport or coming to East Hampton Town Airport. So using kind of big data technology, and big data databases, a company called INREX, we found the origins and destinations of vehicles traveling to or from East Hampton Town Airport in 2022. That data showed us that 58% of the vehicles going to or from East Hampton Town Airport were oriented to the east of the airport, and 42% were oriented west. We assume that the diversion of flights would follow the same patterns, that if folks wanted to go to a destination east of East Hampton Town Airport, if they were not able to, they would divert to Montauk Airport. Similarly, if they were oriented towards a destination west of the town airport, they would prefer to divert to Gabreski or Southampton Heliport. Since Gabreski and the Southampton Heliport can both handle helicopter operations, we simply assumed that half of the helicopter operations oriented west would go to the heliport, and the other half, as well as all the other airframe operations, would go to Gabreski Airport. With respect to Montauk Airport, we were not able to obtain the precise number of annual operations in 2022. We had to estimate the totals based on two sources because we did not receive the data from the airport operator. So we have two kind of baseline scenarios at Montauk Airport. One was estimated using flight track data, so the actual flight tracks in and out of Montauk Airport, and based on that data, we came up with a baseline number of a little bit more than 5,000 annual operations. In addition, the Montauk Airport files a form with the FAA that sets forth various characteristics of the airport, how many runways it has, etc. And it also lists annual operations. And on that form, the Montauk Airport listed that it had approximately 30,000 annual operations. Obviously a big difference between the 5 and the 30. We have no way of knowing precisely which is correct. And so what we did is we ran both. And so all of the impact analyses were done for both scenarios. In addition, we needed to come up with a scenario with respect to Montauk Airport for the number of diverted flights. So since we know that 58% of operations at East Hampton Town Airport have a locational preference to the east of the airport in Montauk, we would want to assign 58% of operations to Montauk. However, we know that jet operations, for the most part, cannot operate at Montauk Airport. So what we did was we actually replaced each jet trip that may have preferred to go to Montauk Airport, but obviously couldn't. We replaced that operation with a non-jet operation that probably preferred to operate at Gabreski or the Southampton Heliport. And what that was able to do for us is we were able to maintain 58% of all diversions from East Hampton Town Airport to Montauk. And we did that because we wanted to come up with, again, the greatest potential impact. So we call this the greatest impact methodology for Montauk, which was basically to say, what is the greatest potential for impacts if all the things align, right? And we did that because we know there's a special sensitivity with respect to the Montauk Airport, given its size, its small size, and its location within the town. So we wanted to make sure that we were looking at, again, the greatest number of potential diversions, so the greatest potential for impacts from the PPR. So we have all this methodology. What did we find about the number of diverted flights? So we found that the PPR would affect approximately 1/4 of annual operations at East Hampton Town Airport, up to about 28% of operations in the summer. So how many operations is that? Well, using that artificially high no action baseline, that 37,000 annual operations, that would be about somewhere between 1.5 and 4 operations per hour in the annual or the summer period, right? So 1.5 to 4. And an operation is a takeoff or a landing. So somewhere between 1.5 and 4 operations per hour would be affected by the PPR at East Hampton Town Airport. Piston aircraft are affected at a lower rate, and helicopters were affected at a much higher rate. At Gabreski, we take that number of operations, we assign the diverted flights to Gabreski, as we just spoke about, and the result is an approximately 6% increase in annual operations at Gabreski Airport and an approximately 8% increase in summer operations at Gabreski Airport. And in terms of the number of flights, again, that's about half to a little more than 1 operation per hour, additional operation per hour at Gabreski. As with the number of flights affected at East Hampton, right, piston aircraft are affected, increase at a lower rate, helicopters at a higher rate. And at Montauk, using the low-end existing conditions, right, so assuming there was 5,000 annual operations at Montauk, the diverted flights would be equal to a 92% annual increase in flights at Montauk Airport and a 99% increase in the summer. Again, putting that to what is the actual number of flights, it's 1 to 2 additional operations per hour at Montauk Airport. Obviously, the percentage increase is much higher at Montauk Airport because it has a lower existing usage. Again, piston aircraft would increase at a lower rate and helicopters at a higher rate. And again, an operation is a takeoff or a landing. So 1 operation per hour would be a takeoff or a landing. 2 operations an hour would be a takeoff and a landing. At Southampton Heliport, the PPR would result in a 43 to 47% increase in operations, and that's a little less than half of an additional operation per hour, or a little less than 1 every 2 hours during the summer. So now that we assigned the potential diverted flights to the various affected airports, we studied the potential impacts of those diverted flights on the airports and the communities surrounding the airports. And the first technical analysis area we looked at was aircraft noise. So the questions we're trying to answer with this noise analysis is, where are the existing noise concerns? Where do they occur? What are they? Where may potential future noise impacts occur? And how can we compare the changes in noise between the different airports, between the different scenarios? So we did that with 3 different ways. One was we looked at flight track data to have an understanding of spatially, right, just looking at a map, where do flights currently operate, over what areas? Where do we see complaints? That's the second. And in what frequency? And then the third was we used noise modeling. So each of those tools helps us to answer the questions above in kind of slightly different ways and really complementary ways. EIS presents flight track data for the 4 airports that we are studying. This is what we commonly refer to as a heat map or density map. The reds and yellows and dark greens are more flight operations over a specific track, and the greens, the lighter greens, are less. The background image of the land is light tan or gray. So as you can see, the flight operations around East Hampton Town Airport cover most of the land that we see in this image. And so we know that there are flight operations occurring to and from the airport over most of the area surrounding the airport. And obviously this is zoomed out quite a bit. We also looked at noise complaint data from 2 different sources. Again, on the top left, what you see are kind of density maps of the locations of noise complaints from East Hampton bound flights or from East Hampton Town Airport. And the bottom right image, you see the location of the flight operation that was complained about. So the top left shows you kind of where the complaints were coming from, and the bottom right shows where the aircraft were at the time that the complaint was made. And both of these tell us about where the potential impacts are now, what areas are feeling the impacts of the current operations at East Hampton Town Airport, and obviously those areas all have the potential to have changes in those impacts with the implementation of the PPR and fewer flights coming to or from the airport. And then the third way we looked at this was through noise modeling. And we use noise modeling really to compare noise across the geographic areas and across the situations. So we only looked at aircraft generated noise, and we looked across the 4 airports and across 3 different operating scenarios, right? The no action scenario, the with the PPR scenario, and the alternative where East Hampton Town Airport ceases flight operations. And we know noise models aren't perfect, but they do provide a way to compare relative noise changes and impacts across these geographic regions. So we've all seen the noise models. I'm going to show you a couple pictures of what's in the DGEIS, but it's important to note that the lines on a noise model output are not like on a property survey. You're not either in or out of an impact. These, again, are representations of potential noise conditions. And again, it's really for comparison. So I just urge folks, as you read through the DGEIS, not to say we're in, we're out. This is a way to help us compare and help the town board compare across different scenarios and across different regions. So how do we even think about noise when we're modeling noise, when we're measuring noise? So we've all heard the term decibels. It's a measure of loudness. It's a logarithmic scale such that an increase of 10 decibels is considered a doubling in noise loudness. And an increase of less than 3 decibels is actually typically not even perceptible. dBA, instead of just dB, refers to A-weighted sound. And what we're doing there is we're weighting the frequencies of noise for those that are most audible to the human ear, right? We want to focus on the noise that we can hear, which kind of makes sense because noise is obviously across a wide spectrum of frequencies. But very few noises occur at a standard rate for a long period of time. So we need to figure out a way to kind of normalize noise measurements across time. And the way we do that is through what's called an LEQ, and it's the equivalent sound level. It's what would the sound level be for a given number of hours that has the same amount of energy as a noise of a certain level. So if a noise of a certain level occurred constantly for 1 hour, it would be equal to an LEQ of 1 hour. And if it fluctuated a lot, it would be somewhere in between the high and the low. And it's simply a way to help us understand, again, what that kind of equivalent sound level is over time, given that most sounds aren't constant. So then if we want to get into kind of a longer period of time and potentially understand a little bit more about how sound impacts us in our daily lives, we look at a measurement called LDN. And LDN is a day-night sound level. It's basically the average of 24 hours of that LEQ1, but it penalizes noise at night by 10 decibels or doubling of the sound because those sounds at night are more annoying, more disruptive. And so it starts to introduce this concept of kind of impact to humans of that level. And then we get to everyone's favorite or least favorite noise measurement which is DNL. And DNL is simply an average of that LDN for a given period of time. Often it's 1 year, but for this analysis, we looked at, again, the annual, the summer, and the peak weekend, because we know that there's a large variability. So for the peak weekend, for instance, that's 3 days, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, that DNL for a peak weekend is simply equal to the LDN of Friday, Saturday, Sunday averaged. That's all it is. In addition to that, we also looked at what's called C-weighted DNL. So we talked about A-weighting, what you can hear. C-weighting basically weights the noise measurements for low frequency sounds. And the reason we did that, it was required in the scope, was because there's a concern about low frequency sounds, which are sometimes perceived as vibrations. When a helicopter, for instance, gets low and you can kind of feel it in the house, feel it in you, or the windows rattle, it's not actually a vibration because the sound is traveling through the air, but it is that same principle. It's an energy that's coming. So we did an analysis of C-weighted DNL to understand kind of what are the changes in low frequency noise as well. So how did we come up with these noise models? So HMMH used the FAA's tool. It's called AEDT, and it looks at aircraft noise and emissions based on very specific parameters of each airport. So the runways, the taxiways, the specific flights that are coming in and out, the specific aircraft that are using that, the arrival and departure routes of each of those specific aircraft, their fuel burns, their emissions, and it's all based on actual observed characteristics at those airports and of the aircraft that are being diverted. So we have rows and rows and rows and thousands of rows of actual airport operations and the actual airframe type, so we can pinpoint noise at various levels in kind of XYZ space, emissions, etc. We modeled the noise down to a level called 50 DNL or 50 decibels of DNL. And really that's the lowest that's kind of reliably modeled for aircraft noise. And so oftentimes you'll hear kind of the FAA, right? You have the 65 DNL. We'll talk about this. We wanted to look as fine-grained as possible, as granular as possible. So we looked down to the 50 DNL level. So these are what the noise models look like. And we have in the EIS these graphics for each airport, for each time period, and for each analysis characteristic, the no action, the PPR, or full closure. And what this shows us is kind of the areas within which that level of noise is present across the airports. And it allows us simply to compare areas and compare relative changes across geographies and across operating situations. Again, it's not to say if you're outside that model line, you don't hear aircraft noise. We know that's not true. Also included in the EIS are comparisons, of our actual increments of changes in the DNL between the scenarios. So this is Montauk Airport, and it's looking at the changes in DNL from the no action condition, what would occur without the PPR, to the with action condition if the PPR were implemented. And again, it's kind of a heat map showing us relative changes. And then getting back to kind of real quick, we know that if you're outside the line, you also hear airport noise. This just shows it, right? Here's our 50 DNL contour for East Hampton Town Airport in the no action condition. And you can see it kind of extends all the way down to Southampton. And we see that the complaint data shows that there are complaints received outside of that data. So we know there are impacts past those lines, but this was the lowest level that we could reliably model. And it gives us an opportunity to compare across the airports. And that comparison is really important. I don't expect everyone to read this table. It is printed in the EIS. But what it shows is that the total land area within that 50 DNL contour. When you look across all 4 airports with the PPR, the total land area would actually decrease within the 50 DNL. So the amount of land within that 50 DNL contour would actually decrease with the implementation of the PPR when summed across all 4 airports. Obviously, it decreases at East Hampton Town Airport, and it increases around the other 4 airports. The same holds true for the number of residences or number of lots with residential structures. With the PPR, the number of lots with residential structures would decrease when considered cumulatively across the 4 airports. Again, obviously, it decreases at East Hampton Town Airport and increases around the other airports. And so the model really allows us to kind of make these comparisons. So what does that really mean then? What are the impacts? Well, Seeker has this term called a significant adverse impact. And this is one of the thresholds in Seeker that looks at that triggers various other discussions of mitigation, which we'll get into in a minute. A significant adverse impact is determined by the lead agency. The lead agency determines what that definition is. And Seeker requires that lead agencies make that determination based on the setting of the impact, its probability and duration, the geographic scope, the magnitude of the impact, and the number of people affected. So oftentimes in environmental review, there are predetermined thresholds that kind of tell us whether or not we have a significant adverse impact, right? In traffic, there are often thresholds. If you go from level of service E to level of service F, that's a significant adverse impact that needs to be mitigated. In the case of aircraft noise, the most common thresholds are the FAA's thresholds. In fact, they're really the only thresholds. And they have kind of a two-pronged approach to looking at a significant impact. One is kind of a desktop model, a screening model. If an action has the potential to increase land area affected by the noise, especially at DNL 65, of 17% or more, then they say, oh, you should run this AEDT model and really find out what's going on. Well, we already ran the AEDT model. So the FAA says, okay, if you have a 1.5 dBA increase in a noise-sensitive area at a house, school, daycare, hospital, if you have a 1 dBA increase in that noise-sensitive area and it experiences at least 65 DNL, you've got a significant adverse impact. So that's the FAA's thresholds, but the town wanted to evaluate those impacts at a more granular level and kind of understand them and allow for potential significant adverse impacts that are different from the FAA. So instead of the 65 DNL, the town said, let's look at the 50 DNL for whether there's a significant adverse impact. We'll stick with the 17%, but let's again keep it at the 50 DNL, and we're going to use the model for this. We're not going to just use the screening tool, we're going to use the model. And we're going to determine that a significant impact, a significant adverse impact could occur if there was a 3 decibel increase in the noise-sensitive area that experiences 50 DNL. So again, at a much lower level, instead of the 65 DNL, it's a much lower level of 50 DNL that the town is considering. Finally, instead of just looking at the annual time period like the FAA does, the town also looked at impacts at the summer time period and the peak weekend time period. So again, really wanted to understand kind of the greatest potential for impacts. This greatest impact methodology was applied to kind of capture as broadly as possible the potential for significant adverse impacts from the PPR. So again, we've layered the greatest impact scenario, the greatest impact methodologies on top of each other. So what are these specific impacts? So the potential for significant adverse impact is present around Montauk Airport with the PPR. Specifically, there are 14 lots with residential uses at or above 50 DNL that may experience an increase of at least 3 decibels. And you can see a picture, a representation of where those lots are on the screen. 11 of those lots are within 400 feet of the airport, and all are within 1,000 feet or quarter mile of the airport. So SECRA requires that mitigation be identified for potential significant adverse impacts. So the town identified two kind of tranches of potential mitigation measures. One is a tranche of measures that the operator of Montauk Airport could take. The operator of the airport, because it is a private use airport that has a PPR, it has some tools available to limit potential increases in volume. It could also establish runway preferences to direct operations away from residential uses, and that would obviously reduce impacts. The town board would request that the airport operator implement these policies when the PPR is implemented so that impacts could be limited to that area. In addition, the second tranche are mitigation measures that the town could also perform. The town could collect a year's worth of data on flight operations at Montauk to determine the actual DNL that occurs with the PPR, right? Since we couldn't actually implement it, all of this is modeled with these various kind of greatest impact scenarios, greatest impact methodologies. The town could collect data to compare the real world effects of the PPR with the no action conditions. And if the residential uses near Montauk Airport actually do experience that significant adverse impact based on that real world data, the town could then assess the feasibility of implementing sound attenuation measures within those residential structures. And again, that would allow for that real world look at the potential impacts of the PPR without all of these greatest impact assumptions. So that was a lot. I apologize for the length, and I thank you very much for your grace in letting us not come out there in the snowstorm. So quick pause, but we have a couple more topic areas to go. But those were the first two biggies. How many flights could be diverted, and what were the aircraft noise? Next, we're looking at air quality. And we performed 3 different air quality analyses with respect to the PPR. The first was a regional emissions analysis. And with this analysis, what we looked at were combined sources, both aircraft emissions and vehicle emissions. We looked at various pollutants, various emission sources, right? We looked at criteria pollutants, carbon monoxide, VOCs, et cetera. We looked at both lead and what are known as hazardous air pollutants using a measure of particulate matter as a proxy, which is very standard for reasons explained in the EIS. And we also looked at greenhouse gas emissions, and those emissions were looked at in metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, CO2e. So what were the results? Any increases in pollutant emissions between those two sources combined were well below any federal de minimis threshold, meaning there is no potential for a significant adverse impact to regional air quality. Again, I don't expect you to read this chart. It is in the EIS, but the top red boxed row shows the federal de minimis standards, which is the standard below which there is no potential for a project to have a significant adverse impact. And the bottom boxed row are the actual changes in emissions from both aircraft and vehicles. And as you can see, the changes are well below those de minimis standards. And for some of these pollutants, they actually decrease. And really what we're seeing here is that the changes in pollutant levels are really hovering right around 0, which kind of makes sense in that we're not really adding or subtracting aircraft using this methodology. We're just moving them around. We also looked the same way. We looked at greenhouse gas emissions. Again, greenhouse gas emissions from aircraft, largely unchanged. potential increase of 36 metric tons per year. To put that in perspective, that's the equivalent of approximately 8 cars in a given year. So it is an increase, but it's an incredibly small increase. And that just has to do with different runway usages, taxiways, et cetera, since, again, we're not adding or subtracting aircraft. Greenhouse gas emissions from personal vehicles, however, would increase. Basically, we're assuming that there would be a new vehicular trip increase owing to those personal vehicles are between 129 and 510 metric tons of CO2e. And that assumes that high end, that 510 metric tons of CO2e, assumes that each aircraft that's diverted is fully occupied, and each of those occupants from the airport take their own car. Probably not going to happen, probably a little lower, but we wanted, again, to evaluate what that potential would be. Another way to put that into perspective is that the combined increase in greenhouse gas emissions is less than 1% of the no action emissions just from aircraft. So if the PPR were not in effect, that's that no action condition. So the increase here is less than 1% of just the no action aircraft emissions. Again, a very low amount. The second analysis we looked at was a micro scale analysis of mobile sources, so cars. We looked at carbon monoxide. We screened for potential impacts at all of the intersections that were included in the traffic study, which we'll get to in a little bit. It was screened using the New York State DOT manual, which again is common. It sets forth various thresholds, and if you don't meet all the thresholds, you're considered to not have the potential for a significant adverse impact. The increases in traffic projected by Vin and his team at LKMA previously, right, were low enough that there is no potential for significant adverse impact as a result of carbon monoxide. Similarly, for PM or particulate matter, again, we're mainly concerned with PM with respect to diesel-powered vehicles. There is no change to diesel-powered vehicles from the proposed project. We're not generating trucks. We're not changing their routes, changing how fast they go. So again, there is no impact to PM. And then finally, we looked at a micro-scale air quality analysis of mobile sources around the airport. So potential air quality impacts in and around the airport as a result of changes in aircraft operations. So the methodology focused on sensitive receptors, residences, basically, within 1,000 feet of the airport, and this is using DEC guidance. We took the emissions that were calculated from the AEDT model, again, very specific to that airport and to the fleet mix, and we reviewed surface wind conditions, because again, what we're looking at is concentrations of various pollutants, so that's an over time sort of thing, both a short term as well as a long term, but again, it's over time. And the pollutant concentrations that were looked at were determined to not have the potential to significantly affect air quality, either the short term or the annual period. The increases from aircraft emissions at the affected airports were relatively small. I'm using kind of the non-technical terms here, relatively small, but more detail obviously provided in the EIS. And the closest sensitive receptors are predominantly upwind of the airports, which means we analyzed 5 different peak hours. Normally traffic studies look at 2, maybe 3. We looked at 5 to capture kind of the full potential for the PPR to have impacts. They added and subtracted traffic volumes from the various airports based on the number and the type of diverted flights. And that's because they had to come up with this number. We had to develop this number because there is no industry standard trip generation factor for diverted helicopter flights, diverted jet flights. So we needed to develop it. So Vin and his team looked at the East Hampton Town Airport, looked at the actual operations of aircraft, looked at the actual traffic volumes in and out of the airport, correlated the two, and came up with these custom factors of trip generation for each peak hour. And what really ends up happening is you take the observed volumes that occurred at East Hampton Town Airport and basically redistribute a portion of those to the affected airports. So we know how many flights are coming in and out of East Hampton Town Airport. We know how many vehicles were coming in and out of East Hampton Town Airport. And based on the diverted flights, the number of flights, the type of flights, how many passengers it can hold, we redistributed that traffic, in essence, to the affected airports. The maximum change in a peak hour in traffic volumes at the airports, the maximum increase was 12 vehicles an hour in kind of the worst peak hour at Montauk Airport, and a reduction at East Hampton by approximately 21 vehicles per hour, again, in the most impacted peak hour. Using those changes in traffic volumes, the intersection capacities and level of service were evaluated, and the only change in level of service as a result of the proposed action was a slight improvement at an intersection proximate to East Hampton Town Airport. There were small reductions in intersection delays around East Hampton Town Airport, and again, minimal to small, no more than 3-second increase in intersection delays at any of the intersections around the affected airports. And as a result, there is no potential for the PPR to have a significant adverse impact on traffic conditions at any of the 23 studied intersections. As you would expect, the potential for impacts from vehicular noise, whether considered on its own or cumulatively with changes in aircraft noise, again, not perceptible owing to the increase in traffic. Next, we performed a natural resources assessment and looked at potential impacts of the PPR to natural and no impacts to plants, insects, amphibians, or reptiles. And that's explained in more detail in the DEIS. So what we did look at is the potential impacts to birds and mammals, particularly of noise and changes in the number of flights. And we looked at it during the summer period. And the reason for that is that's when the potential exists, the most potential exists for impacts to those species. That's during their breeding and nesting seasons often. And it also really is that period during which there's the maximum or highest increase in sound levels that's not really intermittent. Yes, a peak weekend in the peak summer has a higher level of noise, but it's really not a sustained condition. And for reasons described in the EIS, it was more appropriate to look at the summer period. So around each airport, we characterized and analyzed ecological communities, wildlife, threatened and endangered species. We used a diverse set of existing data, published data from government sources, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, New York Natural Heritage Program, DEC, as well as literature review of scientific literature, other government publications, and non-governmental organizations. The result was, based on that review, is that there would not be a significant adverse impact to to natural resources as a result of the PPR. A reduction in aircraft noise may have a potential for a minor beneficial impact around East Hampton Town Airport, but changes in aircraft noise in and around the affected airports are not anticipated to have an significant adverse impact on wildlife. And that's because the species are already acclimated to the noise of an airport, and based on the literature review, would be able to adjust to incremental increases in noise. It's also important to point out that wildlife, including various threatened and endangered species, are known to occur at or approximate to airports of much greater intensity. So we also know that those species can have a particularly high tolerance to aircraft operations. Finally, we looked at the potential for the proposed action to have impacts to land uses, public policy, and community character. So to start with, we characterized the land uses and the character of the areas surrounding each airport. We then analyzed the potential for the cumulative changes in air traffic, aircraft noise, changes in aircraft noise, vehicular traffic, and we looked kind of cumulatively at the potential for those changes to impact land use patterns and community character. And as discussed in the DGEIS, there was not the potential for a significant adverse impact to land uses or the community character based on those analyses. And again, there's a lot more detail in the EIS, but I wanted to give a high level of that. We also looked at 15 public policy documents from 4 municipalities and analyzed the compatibility of the PPR with those public policy documents. Based on a review of each of those 15 documents, the proposed action was identified as being generally consistent with the relevant public policies of the 4 municipalities that were evaluated. And finally, we evaluated the PPR with respect to environmental justice. Environmental justice refers to the fair and meaningful treatment of all people, regardless of race, income, national origin, or color, with respect to development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. It's important to note that environmental justice as an area of environmental review and regulation is an evolving area. The regulations and definitions regarding environmental justice are changing rapidly, and they're due to change again this year. So we looked at 2 different definitions of potential environmental justice communities. We looked at what are called potential environmental justice areas, and that's through the New York State DEC policy 29. That's kind of what I'll call the old definition or current definition. And then the definition of disadvantaged communities, which is the new definition, and it's about to become operable. And this came out of the state's climate justice working group. So we looked at both definitions, which are relatively similar, but there are differences. So what is the potential of the PPR to affect communities of concern? Well, the areas proximate to East Hampton Town Airport would not experience adverse environmental impacts, and therefore there is no potential for areas proximate to the airport to kind of experience those concerns. Similarly, there is no PEJA or disadvantaged community proximate to Montauk Airport. So we focused instead on the Southampton Heliport and Gabreski. There is a disadvantaged community identified within 10 miles of the Southampton Heliport. It's outside of the 50 DNL contour, but it is present, again, within 10 miles. 2 things we looked at was, is there a significant adverse impact to that community? And the answer here is no, there was not a significant adverse impact identified in the EIS to this community. And similarly, is the second question is there a disproportionate impact? And no, there was not a disproportionate impact to this disadvantaged community. Surrounding Gabreski Airport, there were both disadvantaged communities and PEJAs. I'll call them environmental justice communities here. They're both present proximate to the airport and within the 50 DNL contour. Again, no significant adverse impact was identified to those environmental justice communities. And in addition to the lack of significant impact, no disproportionate adverse impact was identified. So we looked at both, was there a significant impact, and is there a non-significant impact that disproportionately affects that community? And the answer was no to both of those. Finally, and I swear we're coming down the home stretch here, the EIS includes an analysis of alternatives. And as we talked about nearly an hour ago, SECR requires the evaluation of a range of reasonable alternatives that are feasible, considering the objectives and capabilities of the project sponsor. And those are very important caveats. So as required by the scope and SECR regulations, we looked at the no action alternative. And that would maintain the status quo for East Hampton Town Airport. There'd be no PPR. As we know, the number of flight operations are anticipated to increase, and it would be likely that conditions similar to the no action condition would occur. Importantly, this action does not meet the purpose and need of the town. So second, we looked at alternative restrictions, so kind of variations on a theme of the permissions that are proposed. It's important to note that as we ran through the potential impacts of the PPR on the number of flight operations, one operation could be affected, and in fact, in many cases was affected, by multiple permissions. So when we look at alternatives to one permission at a time, it's really for a comparison, because that operation could be affected by another permission. So again, we're kind of looking at variations and kind of comparing potentials. So the alternative time-based restriction that was evaluated was allowing flight operations at East Hampton Town Airport for 1 extra hour in the morning and evening on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays. Obviously, that would have the result of affecting fewer operations. So 28% fewer operations would be affected by the time-based permission during the course of a year, and 52% fewer operations would be affected by this alternative time-based permission on the weekend. And about 2/3 of that kind of increase in potential operations would occur in the evening. We looked at an alternative operator-based permission on the weekend. We looked at an alternative size-based permission. Again, this is based on the weight of an aircraft. Currently, the PPR includes a restriction on aircraft greater than 50,000 pounds. So we looked at what would happen at 40,000 pounds, and a little less than 2% of all East Hampton Airport flights would fall into that 40 to 50,000 pound range. So that's about 637 operations. As you would expect, all of them are jets. They'd all be diverted to Gabreski. Finally, we looked at an alternative noise-based permission. In the PPR, the most noisy aircraft are defined as those with a noise rating of 91.0. Those aircraft are limited to 1 round trip per day. That permission affects 18% of EHTA operations. Reducing that definition of noisy to 85 would increase the number of operations affected to 27%, and dropping it down 1 more decibel to 84 would increase that to 37% of operations. So you can kind of see the cutoff. And then the third alternative we looked at was the cessation of airport operations or closure of East Hampton Airport when it's legally permissible. One of the things this alternative does for us in the EIS is it bounds the potential environmental impacts of any change that's implemented in airport operations. So we have the no action condition, as if you did nothing. We have the PPR condition, where some flights are restricted. And then we have the condition where there are no flights at East Hampton Town Airport. So any change in operation, any change in the PPR has to have impact somewhere in between the no action and the full closure. So that's one of the reasons that we looked at this. We used the same assumptions as the proposed action. We conducted the same analyses. And what we found is that similar to the PPR, there would not be a significant adverse impact from cessation of airport operations to energy, air quality, traffic, natural resources, land use, or community character. The only potential for significant adverse impacts would be as a result of aircraft noise. So around Montauk Airport, there's a larger area that has a potential for significant adverse impacts. So it's 35 lots instead of the 14 that were identified in the PPR. And around the Southampton heliport, there are 7 lots all within 700 feet of the heliport that have a potential to experience a significant adverse impact. Similar to the proposed action, there's a cumulative reduction in land area and number of residential properties within the 50 DNL with the cessation of airport operations when you look at it across all 4 airports. So similarly, there'd be less land area and fewer residential properties within the 50 DNL. So that's the DGEIS in a nutshell, a large one at that. So the next procedural steps, we believe the town board, as Dan said at the outset, is in a position after their review over the past several months to consider acceptance of the DGEIS as complete. And that would allow the publication of the DGEIS. We would be able to receive public comments at a public hearing and through written comments. It'd be published on the web, at the town clerk's office. We'd recommend the libraries. We'd send the notices out to neighboring communities. And then after that, the town would respond, after they accept public comments, would respond to all of the substantive comments in an FGEIS. Again, posted here, and we'll post on the web kind of a web address that we suggest, as well as an email address to which the public can send their public comments on the DGEIS. And that is all I have for today. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have about the content of the DGEIS or the next procedural steps.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you. Peter, you want to take your PowerPoint down and then
I do.
beautiful. And take a deep breath. All right. So do board members have any questions?
I'm fine at this point.
I have none.
So I'd like to have a resolution on for tonight to accept the DGEIS and to set a public hearing for Wednesday, March 13th at 6 o'clock here in Town Hall. Dan, is there anything else we need to know?
Let me just double check one thing. The hearing date, yes, March 13th. The resolution has been drafted. I think John or Rob has that for you. No, it's just now would be the opportunity for the public to begin to provide us with their comments. We're looking forward to that. And I believe the resolution has a close of the public comment periods at this point at April 2nd. So it's a good amount of time. The document requires attention to plow through, as you well know. It is not a simple read. I do encourage people to look at and work with the hundreds of figures that are in there that demonstrate the various overlays of noise and impact areas and comparing them. It takes a little practice, but it helps broaden the understanding of what's happening. Those graphic images of the noise effects, and again, this is a different type of an EIS than most municipalities and the public sees, because it's a technical orientation that far more than sort of land disturbance. But the same principles are being applied. The effort to come up with modeling approaches that are valid and informative is sort of remarkable here. We're cutting new ground on a lot of issues, and one of the nice things about the seeker law is it doesn't proscribe particular things for every circumstance. It provides guidance and an overall view, but as a lead agency, I think the document serves you well, but now is to get the public comments. So, thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dan. What I do want to point out, I want to thank Tina Lagaren from our planning department, our assistant planning director. She has been the point person for the town on this project, and it's been a 14-month project since we first kicked this off. From what I understand, there were over 2,000 pages in the draft GEIS. Tina's poured over every single page and the analysis, and we're grateful for that and for getting it all set up on the website. So we have a resolution on for tonight. Should we adopt it, the website will go live with the draft GEIS, all its appendices. We also have a special email address where we'll be accepting comments, and that will be airportdgeis@ehamptony.gov. That'll all be on the website. We're going to be sending out a press release tomorrow and notifying folks that are interested and affected parties in all of this. So I think we've got a tight plan put together that goes into effect tomorrow morning.
I just Supervisor, I just would like to note, first of all, I'd like to thank the board members and the new board members for jumping into this since their appointment or since their swearing in, and also to thank Supervisor Van Scoyac and former councilperson Overby, because they worked with us very closely in reviewing the documents during the fall, the drafts. So it's a major effort, but it is as consultants to the municipality, we appreciate the attention that you gave it.
Well, it's been a great collaboration. Obviously, it's an intense process when you have a 2,000-page document that comes out at the end, and we really want to hear from our community, and hopefully people will come to the public hearing, and if they're not comfortable doing that, they'll send in their comments, as Dan said, by the April 2nd in the time frame or 10 days following the close of the public hearing. So we'll be off to the races starting tomorrow. All right, is there anything else? All right.
No.
Folks, thank you very much for joining us today. Peter, I think you should take the rest of the day off. That was an intense presentation to take us through. And
I appreciate your time, and again, appreciate you letting us not go out on Tuesday. It was a tough one. So thank you.
Great. Thank you again. So the last topic we have today is a FIMP update from our colleague David Lease.
Thank you very much, Madam Supervisor. As we are aware, the Fire Island and Montauk Point, all sand beach nourishment projects continue to be underway. We want to just give weekly updates about where we're at, noting that the town board is not in session next week. Our next update will not be until March, and by that time the project might even potentially be complete. But what we will have is access to our town's website information. If anything comes up, we'll put it on the town's website, but also just let everyone know. As you might be seeing on our screen share right now, this gives just a little bit of an update status of where we're at in the project. This is actually as of Tuesday. This shows the different stations that are out there. Currently in Montauk, this is produced by Great Lakes Dredge and Dock Company, and it shows the downtown scope of the project in downtown Montauk from the western side, which has been completed, heading out to the east. Currently, the Ellis Island has just completed Montauk load number 29, which is roughly 240 cubic yards of sand that have been placed to date. With the spreader, as of about 7 o'clock this morning, they were at station 4085.50. For no one that speaks that lingo, they're pretty much at in front of the Montauk Blue or the Royal Atlantic, which is going to be South Edgemere. Yeah, South Edgemere. Thank you very much. The beach overpass there in between Embassy and Edgemere right now, they're working through. This quantifies about approximately 30% of the completion of the project. The weather so far has been optimal up until Tuesday, but the forecast has greater winds in the near future. Ellis Island intends to ride out the storm, which they did, and any other upcoming wind right now. At sea, and the suspension of any operations will be at the discretion of the captain. As of now, and as of this morning, when Councilmember Flight and I were out there, the work is ongoing, but it's still always weather dependent. As the town board is aware, we want to make sure the public is aware that the start of the project has drawn numerous visitors and spectators to the project site. That said, most have abided by not entering the beach itself, but staying closer to the dune, but still unfortunately past some of the fenced-off areas. The Great Lakes Dredge and Dock will continue their safety area, but also town resources will continue to monitor this aspect. Due to the change of the actual mobilization heading from west to east on this project, they are actually informed me today that they'll be extending the 1,000-foot no entry zone. Primarily, it's going to be going from South Eton and heading east as the project goes right now because of the amount of equipment that they have there. So we'll update the public to that. But they're saying, you know, the contracting company says that the public's been extremely respectful. So for that, on my behalf of the town council, thank you very much to the residents and visitors for making sure that we allow the contractors to do their work. The supervisor and town board members had site visits to an on-site meeting with the contractor and representatives of the Army Corps of Engineers this past Saturday to review the project, material quantity, and press for answers to outstanding questions about the public access points, among other questions. I thank the supervisor and other board members from going there. This morning, Councilmember Flight, myself, had a tour of the property with Suffolk County legislator Ann Welker. She had a site visit also then too. She was impressed by the project. She's aware of this type of project as she was a trustee, I believe, or just knowledgeable as a community member of the project in Sagaponack that they did in 2013. As conditions change, I will update as necessary. And as always, please reach out to my office if any of the public has any questions or need of any specific information that I can answer about the project. The town board wants to thank all the residents and town staff for working collectively to this point to inform the public and keep them safe. That's all I have today. We've been communicating with property owners as much as possible to keep them updated. The project slowed down a little bit because of the weather, but they're still on track to potentially be finished within the next 2 weeks as far as this portion of the project then too. And that's the beach infill. Then we'll come in sand and also thank you, Chelsea Walker. I greatly appreciate that. Sand fencing and also sand plugs will come in next then too. So that's my update. Any questions of the board members?
Well, I know we've had concern and we've stated that to the Army Corps and to the DEC about the public access crossovers, which you mentioned. So those 4 crossovers are really unusable at this point because they've taken quite a beating from Mother Nature, and we're looking for a response from the Army Corps and DEC as to how we move forward there.
That is exactly correct. We continuously bring that up to the Army Corps of Engineers on a weekly basis. Some of them are pretty much terminally damaged. The contractor is fulfilling their contract as far as sand placement underneath the crossovers, but the Army Corps has been evaluating them, and we hope the Army Corps come back and restore them to the appropriate safety factors prior to the summer season, but it might come in with an emergency authorization. I think it's a PL 8499. So we're still pressing on that. I thank the supervisor's office for working with the DEC, the Army Corps of Engineers, and the governor's office on this. There's a lot of different non-federal partners we have to work with. I always want things to go a little faster than normal, but I appreciate you having your pulse on Albany and the DEC, Madam Supervisor, and getting this moved forward.
And Senator Schumer's office has
That's
been
correct.
very helpful too.
That's correct. So that's my update. Again, we won't have a live meeting here, but please feel free to contact myself if there's any questions.
And we'll be posting on social media too.
That's correct.
As we make progress.
That's correct. And so if you're not on the town's social media websites, please sign up for the town's Alert Me Now. That will give more information about either this project or any type of emergency situations that the town might arise in the future then too.
Great. Does anybody else have questions for David? Nope. All right, so we'll move on to liaison reports.
The Armageddon Citizens Advisory Committee met this last Monday. Key areas of discussion were around the senior center. We were planning to do a tour of the proposed site this Saturday at 2 p.m. However, given the ground conditions with the frozen ice, we will be looking to postpone that. The advisory committee is setting up their own subcommittee to discuss the senior center itself. The Human Services Department, there was a walkthrough for interested parties at the Montauk Child Care Center at the Playhouse this past Monday. It was successful. Peconic Estuary, we had our first liaison meeting with the Peconic Estuary Group with Joyce Novak this week. Discussions ongoing, but very constructive. Also had the first meeting of the Marine Museum Restoration Group with Stacey Mars this week. It was actually my first time visiting that center. It is a fantastic town resource, incredible educational, artistic, and marine history. Thoroughly recommend to all residents. East End Fire Commissioners had their first meeting on the 30th of last month. One thing to call out is some proposed changes to OSHA that are coming. These will have implications beyond traditional fire EMS realm and will have potential impacts to lifeguards, police officers, marine patrol while engaged in emergency response roles, such as providing first aid prior to EMS arrival. We will continue to update those departments as to what those implications are, but they are significant. East Hampton Fire Department is hosting a lithium-ion battery emergency response class given by the Suffolk County Fire Academy this evening at 7 p.m. at the East Hampton High School. It is a free class that will cover the latest information regarding technology and response. The East Hampton Fire Department's invited local law enforcement, and the invitation is extended to the town board and any other town personnel who may feel they could benefit from seeing what the situation is. Additionally, in this area, Montauk Fire Department is working with the building department to explore training opportunities at locations scheduled for demolition in the future. Disability Advisory Board, we met this week with some community members to tour the town playgrounds to assess accessibility for disabled community members. We will be putting together a report on that later. East Hampton Youth Task Force, we had our first meeting on January 29th. Key areas of discussion were the rising use of vapes amongst our youth, significance and concerns around the prevalence of the different apparatus to avoid detection, lint rollers, hairbrushes, clothing designed to hide. It's quite amazing how I guess ingenious, you might say, the levels of hiding the stuff has become. The major concern here is around the concentration of the design of the vapes. It's creating a never-seen-before speed and levels of addiction amongst youth and users generally. Additionally, discussed in that meeting were the impacts around social media on mental health. As with the vapes, there are concerns, and we've seen this in Congress recently discussed as well, around the compulsive addictive behavior driven by these social media sites. For both these issues, we are putting together subcommittees to look how the town can best go about combating the rise of these issues. Emergency preparedness, we have a resolution coming up at our next meeting to formalize our first community committee members. Additionally, I met in the last week or so with Jason Rawcliffe, the logistics manager of the American Red Cross, to begin discussions pertaining to supply availability and emergency response.
Great. Thank you, Tom.
The Nature Preserve Committee met last week. Primarily, a lot of our discussion was surrounding the draft management plan that we've been working on for the last couple of meetings, surrounding the field property, which is in Amagansett, which is being looked at as far as a recreational site. the hamlet of Amagansett. That's moving forward at good pace. Look forward to bringing that to the town board, probably in the next, maybe April. I want to let everyone know that this week, or even today, the tree clearing for the Oak Grove Cemetery expansion has started. There is a capital project sign that is up, but again, the tree felling on there is for the removal of the trees for the planned expansion of that cemetery. That brings me into the tree felling for the 395 Panicle project. Please be aware that the contractor should be on the site within the next maybe week to start the tree felling of that installation of the road for the Cantwell Court affordable housing project there. I want to thank Steve Lynch, Superintendent of the Highways, and the members of the Highway Department and the Parks and Recreation Department, Buildings and Grounds Department, for their assistance with a snowstorm that we recently had. Again, the town hasn't seen much snow in the last couple of years, but we did have enough snow to plow the roads and do salt. I also want to thank one of my loved ones for allowing me to teach that person how to drive in snow, because many youth right now might not have driven in snow since they got their licenses.
That is true.
So those are things, as you parent, we might want to teach those new drivers about driving in snow, black ice, because they just haven't seen it really up here.
And is that in a parking lot? That's a good spot for...
It's like even my driveway, you know.
Oh, yeah, my...
Yeah. So I mean, it's just one of those things you don't really think of until it was happening. I found myself waking up about 5:30 in the morning.
Yeah.
It's
very true, David.
It is it comes up, and that's a product of climate change. I don't know, but it's again something that we have to parent as. I had a conversation with Tom Dess, who is the manager of the state parks in these locations. We wanted to discuss the status of their tree felling for fire breaks. They're primarily almost complete with the majority of the fire breaks that would be on Marlin and Shipwreck and on Bayview and Amagansett, and the contractor is currently working in the fire breaks along Cranberry Hole Road and also Nepeak Meadow Road for any fire breaks. Right now, they're moving forward with that, and they're going to look at tree felling some other trees that might be in their park right-of-ways on about around the Cranberry Hole Road Preserve over there. I'm forgetting what the name of their new park over there is. Part of that work continue to press on the New York State DOT for tree felling along Nepeak Stretch. I do know that New York State DOT is spread thin as far as tree felling. You can see them anywhere from here to Brookhaven felling trees, and just currently this past Saturday, they had a tree clearing crew clearing the right-of-way from dead pitch pine trees on State Road 114. In Parks and Recreation, Nipper Guard and a lifeguard pre-training will be starting shortly. Please contact the town's recreational department for more information. That is always a welcome sign of summer ahead as we have snow outside on the ground. And talking about snow on the ground, I was thoroughly happy to get text messages seeing many of our residents and youth enjoying a snow day using the new sledding hill at the Montauk Skate Park. That was fun to see. It provides an open, safe little place to go sledding when we get the snow. It was great to see families out there enjoying. I do want to let the board know I have a resolution on tonight. It's for a notice for public hearing to add a potential concessionaire location for Stephen Hand's Path. That is on tonight also, and I thank Rob Connolly for assisting me with that.
Great, thank you.
That's all I have.
Kate?
Yeah, David, I just want to add thanks to the Highway Department for getting those roads cleared so quickly. It was really fast, and it seemed to happen as soon as the snow stopped. The minute I got out of my driveway, which of course wasn't done, it was clear sailing from there along all the roads in spring. So I just want to give a shout out to them. My My liaison report, I'm just going to give a report on ditch plains activity. As you know, we contracted for a beach profile survey that should be completed at this point. I expect the results of that any minute. I had a preliminary meeting with Dr. Bokanevich, who had come out east as it turned out, he was out yesterday and walked ditch plains. He had been out before that, and he did observe accumulation and accretion of sand, which was good news because at his last viewing, 3 weeks ago after the storms, it was down to complete hardpan. We talked about a preliminary, we had a preliminary discussion on what project would work best for what we need to do at ditch. And in the meantime, there was a suggestion of a immediate helpful solution of snow fencing. Since there is accretion going on right now, it'd be great to, especially in the dune area, to be, I guess it's sand fencing, to be able to capture some of that sand naturally. So I'm working with Kim on a presentation and proposals for that. And in the first week of March, since we're not meeting next week, as David indicated, I'll have a resolution for an RFP for coastal engineering to design plans and provide us with construction consultation on any project out there, and also have a set of plans that are stamped by engineers, which has the potential for helping us with any funding in the future for any destruction of that type of beach that is engineered and stamped with FEMA, which would be another funding source. And I just want to again thank Kathy, the supervisor, for keeping the motion going in a forward direction for any potential funding from our government partners. I appreciate that hasn't stopped. And that's what I have.
Great. Ian?
Nothing new to report.
Okay. I had mentioned last week that I would discuss the meeting we had with the East Hampton Sag Harbor CAC. One of the things we talked about under new business were that members were concerned about real estate signs on properties, that they are oversized according to our code. They include headshots of the realtor, are positioned perpendicular to the property, causing line of sight issues. In some cases, they mentioned in the village that real estate signs need to be parallel to the property, and they think that would be a better way to go forward. So they've suggested some code amendments that would address these issues, as well as more targeted enforcement of the codes for real estate signs that are already in place. CAC members also shared concerns of dead and diseased trees being a fire hazard and inquired if there were grants available to fund their removal. They've invited Best Rattray to an upcoming meeting to inform CAC members about the Anchor Society, and they had presented me with a letter regarding flooding, as they discussed that due to rain bomb events, which are becoming more frequent and are expected to worsen with time as climate change accelerates, since we were so successful collaborating with the county and the state to rectify the persistent flooding that we had on Long Lane and Stephen Hans Path, the project, David, that you oversaw, that that was a very effective result. They'd like to see us collaborate on the areas of 3 Mile Harbor and Abraham's Path, then down by Cedar Street and Floyd Street on Springs Fireplace Road, as they feel that those areas need to be improved because there's flooding along there. I did have some outreach from Ann Welker's office, and the Suffolk County DPW is starting to look into pre-engineering plans for 3 Mile Harbor. I've asked if we could follow the same model we had last time around when they reconstructed Springs Fireplace Road, where the engineers from DPW came out here, met with members, town board members, and our planning staff to try to give them some insight as to what we're experiencing out here as they just start the engineering review of that project. And County Legislator Ann Welker's office was very receptive to that, since it worked well the last time.
Yeah, a lot of those areas would be encapsulated within that project scope also.
Yeah. And then yesterday, I was invited to lunch to meet with the East Hampton clericist. This is, it's actually my third visit there. The first time I went with Adam Fine, and we talked about adolescent mental health. Then last year, I went with Eric Shantz, and we talked about affordable housing. This time around, they was really like a Q&A. They had questions for me, and we were talking about ways that the town and our houses of worship, faith leaders could collaborate. And so we had and they also ways that they could participate in some of our committees. And we had a discussion that, Tom, I know that we've had a number of members attend the youth task force, but I think moving forward, I now have the email list for all of the clerikists from East Hampton to Montauk. So we should invite them to youth task force meetings, and they also may want to participate in the anti-bias task force. So we'll include them there. And then they're very much interested in the town's affordable housing efforts, including the rollout of the ADUs. And we also just talked about, apparently in years past, there used to be an event where a number of the not-for-profits came together so that what Cantor and Rabbi Deborah Stein had mentioned, that there are so many resources here in our community. It's just that not everybody knows how to access them. And if, our faith leaders knew where to turn when folks came to them with issues and concerns, that would be helpful. So I think that that's something that we could work on, as a board and pull that together. Do one we talked about in East Hampton and maybe a smaller one in Montauk, because Reverend Hoffman said not everybody is willing to come across the stretch for such an event. So we could do 2 events. So it was just, I had a warm reception, and it's always great to meet with them. The last thing I just wanted to mention is that this is a 3-day weekend for town staff. The town offices will be closed on Monday, February 19th. So I do believe we have a couple of resolutions
I do.
this afternoon.
I'd like to offer, my pleasure to offer Resolution 2024-252. This is the appoint part-time labor in the Highway Department, Timothy Egan, an hourly rate of $23.98 an hour, effective February 14th, 2024.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
I have Resolution 2024-253, which is authorized reimbursement for fingerprints, and this is to authorize reimbursement to Rachel Satchelbin for the expenses relating to mandatory fingerprint requirement at a cost not to exceed $88.50.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye. I have a Resolution 2024-254, and this is for a Clean Energy Communities Grant application, and the town is seeking grant funding in the amount of $10,000 from Clean Energy Communities to fund studies for 3 municipal buildings to identify recommendations for improving energy efficiency. The buildings are East Hampton Town Hall, Justice Court, and Sanitation, and this project supports the town's commitment to make climate mitigation a guiding principle, an objective for all municipal operations. Grant funding will allow the town to enter an agreement with NYSERDA to hire expert consultants to perform CEC energy studies. The maximum grant funding is $10,000, and the total project cost is $11,400. And from the A fund, a line will be used for the remaining balance of $1,400 that exceeds the grant.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Resolution 2024-255 is a payout upon retirement for Police Officer Timothy Lamprick. Timothy has an accrued vacation time balance of 30 days, sick time balance of 63.25 days, and personal time balance of 3.25 days, for a gross total of $53,596.40 as a final payout.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
256 authorizes that Neji Valera and Alexander Papajohn can attend the New York State Government Officers Association Annual Conference from April 17th to 19th in Albany at a cost not to exceed $1,300.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, so that's all we have for today, or for this afternoon. We'll be back again tonight at 6 o'clock for public hearings and more resolutions. Do we have a motion to go into exec?
Yes, I'd like to make a motion to go into exec session for personnel, agreements, leases, and litigation.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Great. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, LTV.